Ladies and gentlemen, Alderman, the Acting Mayor.
Good evening. Could I please ask the General Manager to recite the Council Address?
Thank you, Acting Mayor. Almighty God, we humbly beseech Thee to vouchsafe Thy blessing upon this Council. Direct and prosper its deliberations to the advancement of Thy glory and the true welfare of the people of the City of Clarence. Amen.
Can I acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal community as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay respect to elders past and present. I should also like to advise that the council meetings, not including the closed meeting, are being recorded audio-visually and will be available on the council website later this week. Before we start with the agenda, we have received a number of complaints about noise from the gallery, making it very difficult for some people to hear what's going on. Can I please ask that any conversations in the gallery and any noise from rappers or whatever are kept to a minimum, as it's very difficult for people to follow what's going on in the chamber. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, if you could make those comments, I think that we need to also state
you will have
that
your
we can't hear you.
You'll have your chance to speak. You'll have your chance to speak later, Mr. Figg.
All right.
Okay, apologies. We have an apology from Alderman Chipman, who's on leave of absence. Confirmation of the minutes of the 29th of July. Do we have a mover, please? Thank you, Alderman Blomley, Alderman Pearce. All in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. In the Mayor's communication, I should just like to mention that the Greater Hobart Bill received royal assent last Friday and will be proclaimed once the regulations are ready, so they can be proclaimed in parallel, and that's expected to happen in the near future. Council workshops. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations? Thank you very much. I believe there are no petitions, Mr. Chairman? No. Public question time. There are no questions on notice, no answers to questions on notice, but there is an answer to a previous question on on notice. General Manager, would you like to say anything in relation to that?
Thank you, Acting Mayor. The response that's been provided, I think, is complete and thorough, and I have nothing further to add to that.
Are there any questions without notice? Would you like to come forward? I'm sure you know you can state your name and address in 3 minutes, but thank you.
My name's Joanne Marsh and I live at 32A King Street, Bellreeve. I'm asking this question on behalf of Victor Marsh, who is working this evening. This question relates to the answer to his previous question about future traffic management planning in the Bellreeve precinct. The term pedestrian connectivity enhancement was used. Given that pedestrians currently feel unsafe in the Bellreeve area, would council officers please give some examples of possible pedestrian connectivity enhancements in the area that will benefit the community?
Are there any other questions?
Firstly, I'll take this opportunity before I start my time to answer the statement that you made.
Point of order, it's a question time.
All right, can you tell me when you said I can't speak till later on when I can speak? Well, I'm answering your question, and I've got a question.
Please feel free to ask a question now.
In other words, we've been gagged. I'll ask a question instead of making a statement because I've been disallowed by one of the aldermen. In the council agenda for tonight, we have in the council workshops the Lauderdale Primary School safety on the 12th of August. Can you please explain why this council promised that I and others from the Advanced Lauderdale Association would be at that workshop and were not told about it?
Sorry, I'm not aware of any invite to any external body or person in respect to Lauderdale Primary School.
Okay, I'll copy the tape and send it to you and ask formally for a response. Secondly, Madam Chairman, can you please answer the question why we cannot answer a statement about ourselves and the communication that you're talking about being allowed from the gallery when we can't even hear you from the gallery because the sound system is so poor, and we've brought that up, myself and about a dozen other people. So the acoustics, I think we have to admit, in this room are very poor. If that's the case, I think instead of addressing the public to shut up and be quiet, maybe you should be addressing the acoustics and the electronics that aren't working. Could you please give an answer to that?
We have done a considerable amount of work to try and make the acoustics better in here, but they are certainly not perfect. Short of changing the building, I'm not sure that we can do very much more at this point, but thank you for your comment.
Right, thank you. Just as a sideline, you may take me as an aggressive person. I am, because I get annoyed that you serve us, yet we seem to be the ones in trouble. But I would like to make a comment here of a positive nature.
Time, please.
And a positive nature, and I'd like to congratulate the General Manager on your appointment. And this is out of the ordinary, but I'm going to take the step of congratulating you, wishing you the best in the future.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Deputations.
Thank you, Mayor. We have one deputation tonight from Ms Denise Hoggan in respect to consultation related to Rosny Hill.
Acting Mayor, Alderman, Mr General Manager. You have to sit separately as a planning authority. We know that. And local government is not government by referendum. These are givens. But these last 10 years, your constituents, your ratepayers, the contributors to your budget in Rosny Montague Bay have felt overlooked. Now, I'm sure that legally everything has been covered. I'm sure that Council has fulfilled its legal obligations with regards to our nature recreation area. But legal obligations don't always represent the gold standard. Now, last year, Clarence Council came close to that standard. It was on the 18th of June last year in your agenda. There was a report signed off by one of your senior managers, and it related to consultation for the Acton tracks and trails. Some 960 letters were sent out. And there was a report in the agenda from page 156 to 222, and I'll refer you to that document as my time is limited. Now, many Rosny Montague Bay residents, and I freely admit I'm one of them, and many of you know this, have concerns regarding a tourist hotel in our suburb. Some of us feel that we're not even worth $750 in stamps. Although in the period that you've been the managing authority, just our little suburb, our small peninsula over there near the bridge, has paid $10 million in rates, probably more. And when the increases go through, in the next 10 years before this project is finished, there'll be maybe 15 to 20 million more. There are other of us within the community that feel that we're being held to ransom. The view seems to be that you will take the tourist hotel or nothing will be done for our recreation area. Sometimes perception is reality, for the ratepayers at least. Sorry, that's the 30 seconds to go.
I do apologise. I
Yes.
was looking at that and it stopped.
No, I
My
have,
apologies.
30 seconds.
I just happen to
Yeah.
have qualifications and experience in qualitative...
Yeah.
May I start again?
Please.
I just happen to have formal qualifications and experience in qualitative research. So instead of just getting up here and whinging, I got out and did some research starting on the 2nd of July. When I tried to hand mine in to the proponent for the hill, I was told, oh, it just goes in Robert's pocket. 3 surveys, I've done them. You have the raw data. It should be in your inbox as I speak. I commend it to you. And I ask that when the opportunity comes, if this is advertised, that you take your opportunities under lupa and make sure that there's more than 14 days of consultation, but the maximum that lupa allows. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, and my apologies for the time again.
Put me off my stride a bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the clock there, and it's no more deputations.
No.
Thank you. Okay. Questions, Pat? Reports from outside, Jordan? Are there any reports from outside from Alderman Walker? Water will be tabled in the closed meeting, and I would expect something from the Greater Hobart Committee for the next council meeting, I would think. Does anyone have any reports from special committees and other bodies to table? Alderman Bomberto.
Yes, Acting Mayor. I have the Alma's Activity Centre 18th of July meeting, and also the Clarence Positive Ageing Advisory Committee 18th of April and 20th of June.
Weekly briefing reports. The weekly briefing reports for the 29th of July and the 5th and 12th of August have been circulated. Can I have someone move they be accepted, please? Thank you, Alderman Walker and Alderman Pearce. Questions? Alderman James.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The weekly briefing report of the 12th of August 2019 and the South Arm Skate Park construction on page 2. My question through you to Mr Graham in his capacity as Group Manager Engineering Services. Mr Graham, in your penultimate paragraph on page 2 of 35, you say, and I quote, following an on-site meeting and consultation with surrounding residents, a landscape plan has been developed and approved by the Council's Manager City Planning. The landscape works are now complete, including the removal of several large pine trees. Mr Graham, the removal of the pine trees, that was left, was it not, to delegation? And wasn't it, I thought, to be included as part of the actual DA or part of the process that was to be set out in the consultation process as part of the development application? But it appears that that's not the case, and that the actual approval of these trees were left to an officer of the council. Perhaps you could elaborate, clarify, please.
Through you, Acting Mayor. It wasn't as part of the DA. The removal of the trees went through extensive consultation with all of the neighbouring properties, and was reported through to council through briefing reports. And the absolute majority from the neighbours and council's landscape officers was for the removal of the trees to allow for things to grow and improve the landscaping for when the skate park is under construction.
So advise that council now plans to sit as a planning authority under the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act. First one for consideration is 11.3.1, a development application for a food van at 151 East Derwent Highway, Lindisfarne. Would someone like to move?
So moved. Thank you. As per the.
Yes, sorry. There is a slightly amended recommendation. My apologies, which has
specifies the hours.
Which specifies the hours. To it.
Just briefly, whilst this nature of food retailing is new in the 7015 postcode, it is something that happens elsewhere. The site is well catered for with car parks, and the hours of operation shouldn't cause conflict with surrounding food businesses in the area and the on-site retail in the form of the petrol station that's there through the weekday hours.
The only thing I'd like to say with that is that I think it's we've talked about this in workshops where we thought we need to look at a review of food vans and those sort of things and how they can be utilised in the city. I think this probably gets us to the point where we need to consider it. I mean, competition is not something that I would stand up here and say that we should be using as a reason to stop competition, but I suppose the thing that we do need to consider is the level playing field approach to this sort of stuff, and making sure that there's certainly with the fees and charges and the compliance costs in relation to a food kitchen are treated the same, or certainly similar than what they are with a fixed business. And I think that's pretty important that we do that. Like I said, it's something that hopefully will allow us to create spaces where people can go and be active and utilise things like the coastal trail, which is something that I've mentioned a few times before. And I certainly think it's timely that we look at this as a broader issue in the future, so that everyone can know in advance what sort of things we've got to consider and have a better plan moving forward with it all. But I certainly think that, as per my last Alderman Walker, called in charge, I can't do that. Alderman Walker's point there, I think the provision of the space and the parking would mean that this is something that we should be supporting at this stage. Thank you.
It's very interesting that a number of the representatives that have actually included their comments in this development application have raised what I think are quite pertinent points. And one of them is that dot point 3, a food van will be unfair competition to the existing businesses. And also there is the dot point 2 on page 15, the proposal will generate traffic hazards and nuisance to adjoining residences. Now, we've had a debate in this place over food vans, and I have been supportive of it. And I've actually suggested that we ought to have these in areas that are not necessarily adjacent to existing food businesses, And that even takes us to where we have the canteens operating on council's land and playing grounds, etc. And even then, to consider having food vans when it's competing with the canteen and these small businesses, small operations, try to make a dollar. So the fact of the matter is that whether you agree or not, the Lindisfarne Fish Shop doesn't necessarily operate on weekends, but it can change. It can change its time if it desires or proceeds to do so. Also, the question about Spencer's, which is on the corner, and I know there is some link between the Lindisfarne Service Centre and what it intends to do as part of the Hill Street development down the track. And that is another story for another time. But the question I have here, and there's 2 points really. A, it's in competition with existing businesses, and that's unfair. It's unfair, and if you're talking about a level playing field, then in fact you have to debate or argue that if the food van was located elsewhere and obviously on private land, which is a factor that's been considered and has been a factor on Clarence Street, then okay, that is okay if it's away from existing businesses. But in this particular instance, it's on a dangerous corner, and Beach Street has been the subject of many discussions, particularly between state infrastructure and also state growth, I should say, and also the council, with that very dangerous corner that actually is on the corner of East Derwent Highway and Beach. So look, I just can't agree with the process of having the food van in that particular location. And it really lends itself, in my view, to having let's proceed with this food van proposal, but in another location, and I think it's going to impact upon not only existing businesses in the area, but it's in a very, very dangerous location, and it's going to attract more vehicles, and into that area attract more traffic movements. And on that note, I don't think I'll support the recommendation.
Yes, I've just got a couple of questions. One of the imposts that have been on other food businesses is the need to manage your waste in the forms of grease traps and things like this. When you have a thing like this, which is obviously capturing its own waste, I'm just wondering what the waste arrangements are, given the fact that this van, although it's temporary, is basically parked there 24/7. So what arrangements are there for discharge of waste?
Through Mr Mayor, those aren't planning considerations that can be had under the planning scheme for it. However, it will have to meet other tests under the environmental health requirements. And I wonder if Mr Tui might be in a position to address what sort of waste disposal requirements they'll need for the food caravan.
Through you, Acting Mayor, there's a range of options available, and if a permit is granted for this activity, would then be regulated under the Food Act and also the Health Act, which will deal with those matters raised.
Which is a very practical consideration for these sorts of businesses, particularly where the van stays there. I note that there have been regularly caravans, this type of food caravan and coffee vans actually pop up on Clarence Street from time to time. I'm assuming they're on private property and they're not infringing on the parking requirements.
Through you, Acting Mayor, the council has approved at least 2 that I can recall on local business zoned land, and they were required to obtain planning approval. I think they were approved by delegation on those cases, and that maybe is why the council's unaware of them.
Because it's an interesting thing, and I pick up Alderman James's comment that this van will be in direct competition. Well, I might suggest that I don't think there are any takeaway pizza spots that close to that. These other coffee shops and pop-up food shops that we're talking about are actually closely located to similar takeaway food premises. So I guess there's not much that we can say about those. Except for the fact that this sort of pop-up business is really becoming the norm, and like it or lump it, that's just the way it is, and these are the things that have to, of course, eventually be driven by the market and not by our regulation.
Yes, Madam Acting Mayor, through you to Mr Lovell, should condition 3 actually detail that the trading hours are Friday to Sunday and the times? Because the report makes it very clear that that's a key component, if you like, that it's not operating all week.
Through you, Acting Mayor, it could, however, because the application was made for those 3 days, the heading of the permit will specify that it's for those.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, there's been a moderate level of debate on this issue, moderate by some of the other matters that come before council. As far as safety on this site goes, let he or she around the aldermanic table that didn't approve the Hill Street development that would have had many cars going out there at all hours, certainly when there was much more activation along the East Derwent Highway, throw the first no vote. But in relation to food vans, they are something that we're going to see more of. There are reasons why this style of food delivery is attractive. It's a lower risk entry into the market for I guess entrepreneurs wanting to try different products. And we've seen in the US, in particular LA, where the culture really developed up initially from the vans that would go to the big building sites and service the construction crew, then in a construction downturn move into other areas. And that's actually been the market which has led to a whole range of developments, from the people that construct the trucks to the jobs in the actual kitchens that are doing some of the preparations, the trialling of the different foods, and the markets that actually find some success and then go to become, if you like, hard and established premises. That again is probably not germane to the specific planning matter. And whilst people can raise issues around competition, again, strictly within the planning parameters that are our shackles, they're not necessarily things that we can consider. But if you want to study up food policy, by all means, we can look at what different places do. I think Los Angeles is a really interesting study. I'm getting the feeling from around this table that the mobster town of Chicago is the way that people like, because in that city, I think the rule they tried to establish was no food van could operate within 100 metres of an established food premises. So study up, fellow colleagues. But I support this motion and seek council support as well.
Motion that the food van at 151 East Derwent Highway be approved subject to conditions. All those in favour? Against? Carried. 11.3.2 is a section 43A amendment application with rezoning and a 28-lot subdivision at Pass Road and Minnow Street. Alderman Bromley.
Madam Acting Mayor, I have an alternate motion that's been circulated to colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Acting Mayor. And firstly, colleagues, I apologise for my voice and in advance of my breaking of a coughing fit. But this item, as we'd be aware, follows an early decision of 6 May and the one representation received during that public exhibition period and the representation coming from the applicant. I had an opportunity earlier this morning to discuss this matter with the applicant, and as a result of this discussion, I've submitted the alternate motion that we have before us this evening. In essence, the sticking points, Madam Mayor, are the quantum of public open space and the calculations used to determine what this will be, and 2, the resultant cash in lieu component this council will seek to impose on the applicant. Madam Acting Mayor, as outlined in our agenda report at pages 35 to 37, we are advised that when the original application was submitted to council, the pedestrian access way was to be 4 metres wide, and as public open space was not provided within the subdivision, the applicant was prepared to make a cash in lieu contribution. However, during further discussions with council officers, in order to deliver enhancements and ensure crime prevention through environment design principles were met, the applicant agreed to increase the size of this public open space walkway by some 250%, from 4 metres wide to a width of 10 metres, arriving at some 350 square metres. Now this 350 square metres equates to 2% of the 5% contribution of public open space being sought for the value of the area of the land in the approved plan described as lots 104 to 122, and equates roughly to some $70,000. Madam Acting Mayor, I was proud of this council when in June of this year we unanimously supported a motion about taking proactive steps to address the housing and homelessness crisis in our city. So if we're truly fair and income about ensuring increasing the amount of housing stock available in our city, they've got to start being fair in the way we treat our developers. We have to stop seeking to gouge at each and every opportunity. Madam Acting Mayor, I commend the motion and seek the support of colleagues.
Well, just in relation to the last point made by Alderman Bromley, I think there tends to be a little bit, I get a bit frustrated when the terms greedy developers and white sheep brigade and these sort of things are used in public debates about these sort of situations, but I don't think people really understand the time and effort and cost that goes into getting these things ready to go towards, to sell and to, basically get a return on investment. And I think, we should certainly look at getting the fees and charges back towards the council that we're entitled to under the scheme and the rules and policies that we have in place, but I certainly wouldn't support anything that involves us taking anything that's more than what is out there in our, in terms of those policies and rules and regulations. So I certainly support Alderman Blomley's approach to basically bring this back in line with in relation to where the developer's done the right thing and allowed us to have an increased piece of land to contribute to public open space and access to the bush reserve. And I think it's only fair that we hold to what our policies are and let them keep to that, because sometimes it's quite a few years before these sorts of things are started and finished, and expecting them to carry the cost and have that put on top of them means that the supply of land and the opportunity for people to get out there and buy properties, and we all know the relationship between supply and demand. And I think anything we can do to get more land available and keep the cost down by not any cost that's put onto the developer is eventually passed on to the consumer. And we've all seen the reports come out in recent days about the fees and charges and the taxes and the levies that are a part of developing a house these days. And if we can do our bit to save a few dollars for the end user, I think it's our responsibility to do that. So I ask support from the rest of the Aldermen.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The point about hold to what our policies are, and this comment was made by Alderman Ewington about 5 seconds ago, and then on the other hand we have a direct departure from that in relation to what is being proposed here. Now this is council policy. Now council policy is quite clear in relation to this, and it says that it's necessary for council to consider that there is a requirement for a 10-metre width, for it's necessary to ensure that it's fit for purpose under the CPTED principles. Now those principles are part and parcel of our policy, and that is that we should be taking or recommending that a full 5% cash in lieu contribution is required. Now that's policy. And on the one hand, to actually get up in here and say that we need to hold to our policies, and on the other hand, make a change to our policies, it just doesn't make sense. The other point that's been made by Alderman Blomley is, in fact, he tried to draw parallels between the homelessness and what has happened in relation to a motion that went through this place a few weeks ago, and that was carried unanimously. But on a different basis, Alderman Blomley, it was quite clear that this was for the homelessness, it was for the development within an area where there was already existing infrastructure, and therefore there was a need for us to try to utilise that vacant space for the needy. And so it's very difficult to try to get up here and say that there was that homelessness debate and then try to use the excuse that we should be varying council policy that's been accepted, and the developers know this, on the basis that it's not a necessary component. If we're going to change our policy on a whim, then okay, we might as well throw our sort of policies or our procedures out the door, because you need some sort of, well, not discretion, but you need some sort of comment that's going to the community, that if council has a policy in relation to this particular matter, or for anything else for that matter, then council needs to adhere to it. If we don't like the 5%, then we change it. And there's nothing stopping either Alderman Blomley or Alderman Newington putting up a proposal to try to change a policy. And it's been done by Alderman von Berto at one of these meetings some years ago, prior to this new council, that is, and that policy was changed. I don't need to go into the detail, but it was discussed, and there was workshops, and there was discussions, and there were workshops, and then finally it got up and got through the council. Now, I support that sort of proposal, always will, but at the same time, if something seems to be a good idea that's contradictory to a policy, then I think it's a sad day if council adheres to that sort of proposal, and then we sort of say, well, it depends on whatever the actual development or whatever the proposal is being forward to council for consideration. I think it's very, very important to stick to a policy, and then we know there is that's being circulated to the community at large. To change it on a whim, I don't think it's the right way this council ought to operate. I will not support the proposal.
Yes, I won't be supporting this proposal either, and I'll be foreshadowing the officer's recommendation.
Second.
It's not a complex thing, you know. The developers are thoroughly aware of council's policies in regard to public open space. They are well known, they're well defined, and might I say, when you get these sorts of greenfields developments, they are usually met without too much trouble. So the policy is well known, and I think it's beholden upon the developer to design the subdivision to meet the council's policy on public open space, or pay the cash in lieu contribution as per the standard policy. It's not, as often I'm one to argue about some of these fees and charges and cash in lieu that council puts, where you've got an existing building, a change of use, and a change of use that, you know, not capable of redesigning the building to meet the change of use. Here we have a greenfield site that has been in the planning stages, I would imagine, for many years, and an opportunity to either design it to meet the council's requirements or pay the price.
Yes, I have some questions for Alderman Blomley through you, Acting Madam Mayor. The planning officers note that the increase to 10 metres was desirable to enhance amenity and broader crime prevention, so I'd like to know if Alderman Blomley is confident that his amended motion addresses that, and the fact that this approach is consistent with similar subdivision applications, whether Alderman Blomley seeks this as similar to Alderman James' request, whether this is a one-off or whether he would seek to change that policy for future subdivisions. And finally, I note on page 37 that it says in section 11.1 of the policy provides that unique circumstances may warrant departure from the policy. So again, I'd like Alderman Blomley to go into more detail about what the unique circumstances are in this particular instance. Thank you.
Good questions to answer now, or
Perhaps you could consider them in your right of reply.
Okay. Well, you might as well jot them down, please. They're quite lengthy and numerous.
Would you like me to?
Don't have to say at the beginning, we've heard you once, but just make sure I cover it from water.
Excuse me, that was unnecessary.
Well, so is asking questions.
No,
As long as we
I'm sure Alderman Warren would jot them down for you if you would like them to be able to answer them in your right of reply. Alderman von Berto.
Thank you. In relation to the report that we've been provided, on page 36, it makes it very clear that Section 511 of Council's Public Open Space Policy 2013 states that land use for the following purposes should not be transferred to Council as public open space. And one of those is actually pedestrian access ways. Further on in the report, the officers determine that this particular pathway is actually a pedestrian access way. And as Alderman Warren actually said, yes, there is discretion in Section 11(1) of the same policy if there are unique circumstances that may warrant a departure from the policy. The officers actually note that they believe that there is not a unique circumstance here, and that importantly, this particular pathway cannot be considered as a recreation area. So I'm afraid I cannot support this alternative motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with the last speakers because Alderman Bonverto just took away what I was going to say. It's very important here that the land is not suitable for recreation space and provides no other function other than a pedestrian connection. Now, I read the same as Alderman Bonverto on page 36, and I think it makes it quite clear here that we can't just pick and choose. We've got a policy, and I believe in this case we've got to stick to it.
Walker.
Yes, that might be more questions than speaking. Just going to again quote the top of page 36. The initially proposed walkway was considered warranted. However, at 4 metres wide, it is considered undesirable and could be enhanced in terms of amenity. Undesirable and could be enhanced. They don't really sound like firm planning words to me. Are they? Just a question through you, Acting Mayor, to the Head of Planning. Is this 4 metres, is this 10 metres a statutory requirement, or is this a desirable request that has been put onto the applicant?
It is not a statutory requirement, but it is, and there's greater flexibility when you're dealing with planning scheme amendments than a planning permit before you. In this case, and in other cases, 10 metres was considered the appropriate width in order to ensure that they're desirable and safe, so that they're not narrow spaces that people can get trapped in, basically.
Yep. So I understand that it is desirable, and to assuage council's desires, it appears that this application is, acceding to a wider thing that would enhance safety and amenity, and yet it's not required of the developer. If this developer was literally just about trying to squeeze every cent, they would just go back to revert to the 4 metres and could have put the application in like this. I guess I have some concerns that in a process where there are rules about what has to be done, here is a situation where some compromises occur, but it seems like that it hasn't been reciprocated in the public open space matter. And I think it's not unreasonable if we want to prevent future applications that are going to have long, narrow, 4 metre minimum things that we consider these applications. Now, in my time here, I've had incredibly specious requests for POS requests to be put down to 2% for no real reason. This is the unique circumstances are a way of give and take for a better overall outcome. And my fear is that if this alternate motion isn't supported, then future applications are going to be around the 4 metres, because it's not a requirement. So if you're going to be hit up, why wouldn't you just stick to the minimum and try to sell lots for a bit more money if they're a bit bigger? So my other question would be the term public open space. That doesn't actually necessarily, whilst there's characteristics of what's required, it's not actually defined as a recreation space, is it?
Through you, Acting Mayor. I'm not sure what the question's getting at, maybe if I try and respond this way. The applicant has proposed it as open space. The officer's recommendation is that it oughtn't to be considered as open space because the policy doesn't take into account walkways. What is the policy driving at when you're talking about open space? It's talking about something that you recreate on. So it might be if it's a long path like this, part of the trail that you recreate on, like the Tangara Trail, or it would be a path of some kind.
Yeah.
In this case, why we said it's a walkway rather than open space is because it doesn't provide for recreation.
Look, unless I'm persuaded by another argument that's about to step up before me, then my inclination is to support this motion on the basis that I don't wish to see 4 metre minimal walkways in such developments going forward, and I think that this was this wasn't just a handout. This was a reasonable request thought through in a process that it derives at a better overall outcome, which is the 10 metres. It was a request that was put and not something that was statutorily required. So at this stage, I think people should support the alternate motion that we're discussing now.
Thank you, Madam Acting Mayor. I really don't think I've got more to add from Alderman Walker's fine contribution this evening, because this is about a negotiated outcome where a developer has engaged with our planning staff, gone from 4 to 10 metres, 250% increase, has provided that, and yet we're going to say, oh no, instead of you being able to put that extra land, that 350 square metres, into extra blocks to make more money, no, we're going to take it, and on top of that, we're going to whack you 5% of the public open space cash in lieu. I mean, let's just be a little bit sensible here. Let's look at this sensibly. Alderman Warren, in regards to the questions that you pose, I can't give a guarantee as to whether the 10 metre wide walkway will stay. I can tell you, I can't speak for the developer. What I can tell you is if I was a developer, I certainly wouldn't be bending over to provide that for the council. Absolutely not. I would go off to the tribunal and I would say, this is a fair outcome here, and I'd roll the dice there. Because what we are asking and expecting this person to do, this significant investor in our city, this significant employer in our city to do, is unreasonable. Absolutely unreasonable. And the other two questions, I have to excuse my...
the unique circumstances that allows us to waive the...
Well, I think that they've been covered off in some detail, both in my opening remarks and the contribution from both Alderman Newington and Alderman Walker. If they haven't, that's up, of course, if it's going to be voted down this evening, go to the tribunal, and yet again, we will experience, Madam Acting Mayor, another person wishing to invest in our great city, having to go to the trouble, the time and the expense of going to the Tasmanian Planning Commission. This is ridiculous. This is ludicrous.
And my third point, Mayor,
Please.
was whether you saw this as because this is consistent with similar subdivisions, whether you saw this as a one-off or whether you were seeking to change the policy.
Well, I think that every planning application that comes before this council is unique, and they should all be considered on their merits, individual merits. And here we have a situation, repeat again, Madam Acting Mayor, of a developer who is bending over backwards with the right thing. Surely to goodness, the least we can do is meet this person halfway and say this is a fair outcome. I seek the support of colleagues.
Thank you, Alderman Blomley. I'll put the motion as amended for the Section 43A amendment application and 28 lot subdivision. All those in favour? Those against? Motion is lost. Alderman Holder.
I think I'll move the officer's recommendation. A fair bit has been said at this stage, and I might just pick up that that is the role of the Planning Commission to actually, should these conditions be appealed, that is then a discussion to be had in the Planning Commission, which is the proper place for that discussion to be had, I would think, if the developer is unable to convince the planning staff that it's an appropriate exchange. And don't forget, the exchange mooted was related to non-recreational space, access way. So whether the Planning Commission is prepared to negotiate such a settlement, that's its role. As I put forward in a motion here some time ago, which received unanimous support, trying to insert a mediation phase into these sorts of planning decisions. But that, at this stage, that is not the role of council or the planning staff, that is the role of the Planning Commission. And so I have no qualms about this being taken to the proper authorities and allow them to make the judgment. At the same time, I see no special need for our long-standing policy on public open space and cash in lieu contributions to be circumvented in this particular case.
I've said, thanks.
Any other speakers? Alderman Ewington.
Just a quick one. The circumstances are quite clear that we've deviated from what the policy states. If we ask a guy to change the amount of space he's got to give away for an access, and then we still want to not take that into account with calculating his fees, that's wrong. You know, and it's only someone's opinion as to whether it's recreational. I mean, it's recreational because there's more people going to use that space. I mean, we could argue till the cows come home about whether it is or it isn't, but the bottom line is we've asked him to give up the land, and then, as what I understand, he was told that that would be taken into account, and then turn around and then not taking that into account with the calculation of fees. I just can't agree with that. I just think it's unfair.
A pithy one sentence just to say that on these sort of areas there'll probably be more passive recreation with people walking than some of the gormless, useless triangles that sometimes get counted as public open space in some of the subdivisions that just sit there gathering weeds.
Thank you, Alderman Walker. Are there any other speakers? Right reply, Alderman Walder.
The last one I don't think I need to make a judgment on. But the fact is that the walkway is not public open space. That's right. And that other developers, and many of them, have not been given these sorts of leeways or these sorts of free kicks. So I think we are on very dangerous grounds when we start giving these sorts of free kicks to particular developers who were in a position to design a suburb that met all the requirements without the need for public open space.
Put the motion that the Section 43A amendment application for proposed rezoning and 28 lot subdivision at Pass Road and Minnow Street be approved subject to conditions and advice. All in favour? Against? The motion is carried. 11.3.3 is a subdivision application at 90A and 92 Gordons Hill Road, Lindisfarne. There is an amended motion with information about the supply of water, which I believe was circulated to everyone. Yes.
There is an amendment to this motion, is there?
It is an extension to condition 4, which talks about the stormwater connection and detention.
Was that circulated?
It was circulated
on Friday, was it?
Yes, and
okay, I think it was emailed. Is that right, Mr?
Yes, I believe it was sent.
I did cite it. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes, thanks. Yep, I did. Thanks.
No problem. Would somebody like to move the...
So moved. Thanks.
Thank you, Alderman James. Seconder. Thank you, Alderman Ewington.
And only to say that I think this is appropriate. I did read it on Saturday evening, which was quite unusual for me on a Saturday night. But nevertheless, I think it does tick all boxes, and I think at the end of the day there is this provision that council's land, obviously being part and parcel of this proposal, is in fact maintained under council ownership, but at the same time the responsibility to upkeep is still in the hands of the developers and under council's obviously supervision. So I seek council support.
As per officer's recommendation.
Any other speakers? No need for a right of reply, Alderman James? I'll put the motion that the subdivision application at 90A and 92 Gordons Hill Road be approved subject to conditions and advice. All in favour? Carried unanimously. 11.3.4 is a development application for additions and change of use to visitor accommodation in Cottesloe Street in Lindisfarne. Thank you, Alderman Blomley. Do I have a seconder? Alderman Newington. Thank you. Alderman Blomley, would you like to speak to it?
Madam Acting Mayor, as per the officer's recommendation.
Any others?
A question. Yes, look, thank you. The question I have is, and it relates to a number of visitor accommodation proposals that's been presented to this place over time. And it was my understanding, Mr. Lovell, that there was a advice section that should the nature of visitor accommodation change as per the permit, that the applicant be advised of that. Now, how different is that to the Rose Bay one when we considered that some time ago for visitor accommodation, and we had that lengthy advice sentences incorporated in it? How different is it from that particular application and to the one in Cottesloe when it doesn't appear, other than the building work is to comply with the National Construction Code Part 3 fire separation, and that's it? Is there something I missed in relation to this, or is it based on its merits?
Acting Mayor, I'm sorry, I can't recall those other cases. So maybe if I can just say this, that because this permit specifies which units are to be used for what purpose, then if there's a change to the way the permit operates, then that will be a matter that we'll follow if necessary.
Are there any other speakers? Reply, Alderman Blomley? I'll put the motion that the change of use at 16 Cottesloe Street, Lindisfarne to visitor accommodation be approved subject to conditions and advice. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Um, 11.7. That concludes the Planning Authority. Thank you very much. Consideration of council delegations under the Land Use and Planning Approvals Act 1993. Somebody like to move the recommendation?
I'll move the recommendation.
Thank you very much, Alderman Bomberto. Second it? Alderman Newington, thank you. Would you like to speak to it, Alderman Bomberto?
No, thank you. We've actually deliberated this at a council workshop recently, and it makes great sense to me. Thank you.
As per officers and Alderman von Berto's recommendation.
Any other speakers?
Just a question in relation to, through you to Mr Nelson, General Manager, Clarence City Council. Mr Nelson, is this just a sort of a matter of mechanics, or sort of just keeping the machinery rolling along and so forth and so on? It doesn't, does it not impact upon the council as the sort of a planning authority or the authority on a lot of these issues in relation to the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act. Is this just a sort of a mechanical sort of process, and it doesn't usually usurp the responsibilities or the power of the council itself?
Through you, Acting Mayor. Thank you for the question. The delegation's been put forward for a number of reasons, but principally it's in an effort to improve the administration of planning applications and to expedite them as efficiently as possible. As you'll probably understand, the planning reports and the processes that are required under LUPA, and particularly in respect to the 42-day time clock, put a lot of effort on council officers and also on council to deal with matters that are by and large fairly mechanical in nature. The way that the delegation has been structured has been to exclude all significant planning matters over $10 million. They will still go to a special council meeting, and also to exclude any matter where a refusal is recommended. They will still come to council. When you look at the statistics within the report, you'll see that there is a significant number of applications with only one delegation that go through to council, in effect to have the recommendation approved with no change whatsoever. So the principle behind this is really about providing efficiency in terms of council's operations to remain within our budgeted resource allocation, but also to provide a better service to our customers, the ratepayers of the City of Clarence.
Further question to Mr Nelson. On page 97, under para 3.3, it does refer, amongst other things, to a trigger to refer to council for decisions. Should this recommendation proceed or is approved by council, does it mean that if there is one representation lodged in respect of a proposal and for refusal, does that mean that that particular matter is now in the hands of the staff to actually approve or otherwise? Or is it still to go through a normal process as we've known it to be? That is, if there is one refusal in relation to a particular proposal, then in the part, and up till now it would seem, we would consider it by council. Does this change that particular proposal?
Sorry, maybe a point of clarification. I think by refusal you're saying that someone who makes a submission seeking to object to the particular application, is that what you're referring to as a refusal? So in that circumstance there's no granularity in terms of a representor objecting. It's simply the one representation that would be the trigger, so it's just the representation itself. However, if the officer's recommendation is to refuse the DA, it will always come through to council.
Clarify as to whether this proposal, one representative puts in a application and that application is opposing the particular development application. Does that matter still come to council, or under this delegation it would not?
It would not.
It would not. Okay. I would like to continue to speak to this, and I did at the workshop because in the past we have considered a representation, one representation, and it has been debated that in fact may take unnecessary time to go through the process and the staff's time involved in doing that very submission or report to council. under this proposal, one representative who would have otherwise had his day in council or been able to speak at a council meeting in either for or against the proposal, in this case if he objected to it or she objected to it, then that no longer happens if this motion is carried. One representative doesn't have his or her day in council because under the delegation that's been proposed here, it would not happen. So therefore you're going to have people out there who, and for very good reason, they may have done time benefit analyses, they may have gone through all the different matters of council policy and also under council's bylaws, you know, they may have a legitimate reason why they're opposed to this. And it's one objector, one representative, and they will not have their day in council. And I think that is wrong because one person may be able to sway this body of learned people who in fact can make a decision in relation to his or her particular concern. And it's been thoroughly researched by that person. It's not of a vexatious or frivolous nature, not at all. So look, I think we are really starting to tread on dangerous ground. I'm not opposed to the time that is spent on preparing agenda, but if at the end of the day you have this sort of comment made that one person's view or one person's representation is worth naught for the consideration of the elected members, then where does it go from there? It goes from one representative to two representatives. Oh, it's only three representatives this time. So therefore we're going to bring it forward. I don't support it.
Thank you, Alderman James. Any other speakers? Alderman Edmonds and then Alderman Warren.
I'll be extremely brief. I share some of I missed our workshop on this and I share some of what Alderman James had to say, but I'm sort of reassured by the fact that we'll review this after a year and also looking at some of the policies of other councils where the bar is far higher. So I'll support tonight's recommendation, but I do look forward to a review.
Yes, I understand Alderman James's concerns and I thank Alderman Edmonds for his contribution, and likewise, while I'm concerned that those one representative may not get the chance to persuade the council, we know that the planning officers have looked at the representation to see if there are any points that can be considered, and noting the statistics that last year we did have 64 representations which had to come to council, and that causes a delay to those people receiving a response to their planning application. So again, the chance to review gives me comfort. I think on balance, giving our clients a better turnaround is worth considering.
The reason that we are here as a council, we are elected people, we are elected by the people to be their voice, to represent them. Now, I know for extreme efficiency of processes, we could adopt the Bernie model where the General Manager in his wisdom decides what does and doesn't come to the public forum. We could adopt the policy of other councils where there's got to be more than 2 or 3. But one voice, even if it has no effect, they're entitled to be heard, and they're entitled to come here and make a deputation, and they should be entitled to have the process explained to them in debate around this chamber, as we've often done here, being able to empathise with them, but just explain to them the limitations that the planning scheme places on us, and that we can't do it. That is part of the education. But I fear that, that we're actually neglecting our responsibility to allow the people to be heard when we go and say, there's only one. I mean, One is still a legitimate opinion. One is someone who pays rates to this council and entitled to have their voice heard on matters such as planning matters. Now, it's extremely efficient, I know, to actually bypass this debating chamber, but the Act set it up for that purpose. Now, you know, I mean, if we were sitting here, council after council, sitting till 3 a.m. in the morning, you know, processing planning applications, then I would say, yes, you know, we need to streamline this process because it is taking far too much time for so little effect. But that's not the case. In fact, some of our council meetings have been pretty short of late, you know, and so I'm opposed to this because I think that every time we deny the people a voice, we are putting ourselves on the block as riding roughshod over the people's concerns, be they legitimate or not legitimate, be whether we agree with them or not agree with them. I think that someone who is affected by a planning application has the right to be heard.
Thank you, Alderman Mulder. Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, let's make this clear. People will still write to us, and we have got the chance to get clarification from officers. Nothing like that is going to change. Sometimes, as we all know, and I don't expect everybody to understand the planning scheme out there, but sometimes we do get representations that are totally irrelevant, and I think if the officers can judge that and have a quicker turnaround for people that do want to do development in this city, I think that's a bonus. Now, as I said, we're all going to get emails and we're all going to still ask questions, so nothing's going to change in that sense. So I certainly think this is the way to go. And when you look at, like I think Alderman Walker said, Launceston has 3 representations for refusal at the workshop, and he said no one's screaming up and down, and this was at the workshop, and no one's screaming up and down how bad it is. I mean, this is one objection. As I say, I don't think things are really going to change for Aldermen. We still have the chance to ask our officers questions.
Walker.
So you look at the table, the big 3 councils being Clarence, Hobart, Launceston that are listed there. Under this change, the threshold will still remain the lowest in Clarence. So that's point 1, the low threshold. Point 2, if you like, is the 12-month sunset clause in effect of a review that will be undertaken at that time. We've talked about a range of things. Certainly in recent history there's been talk about housing challenges and what we as a council can be doing to play our part in assisting this. And certainly, I guess, officers' time spent looking at applications versus, writing reports for us at certain levels will hopefully produce the productivity dividend in a period of growth. But we do have those, as I said, the threshold, the sunset clause. I'll make one final point though. If a development application comes forward and there are two representations strongly in support of it, it will trigger a report to council and come before us. 2 or more.
Thank you, Alderman Walker. Any other speakers? Alderman Wombat, put the motion that we resolve to approve the delegations as listed in the agenda. All those in favour? Against? Carried. 11.7.2 is a motion regarding the Howrah-Rokeby subdivision boundary alteration. Alderman Mulder.
Before I move both motions, on the Friday's workshop there was some suggestion that we should take them, recommendation A and recommendation B separately. I don't know whether that was your plan or...
Happy to take them separately if people are happy to do that.
I'd certainly like that approach.
It was your comment or comment that I was picking up on. So I will then in that case move recommendation A.
I'll support recommendation A.
Yes, not a great deal needs to be said. I think we've been through this rocky road a fair bit of the time. The brief history, of course, was that an initial proposal to create a new suburb in this area was passed by this council. but on advice eventually from the Surveyor General acting as the chair of the nomenclature board, it was decided that a new suburb was not proposal, but that we need to get together and either choose not to move the boundaries at all, the status quo, or a number of options were drawn up about how parts of proposed new subdivisions could be done, and they came out as options 1, 2 and 3. As you're aware, I involved myself in some consultations with some of the developers because the Surveyor General also made it clear that the only people that needed to be consulted for his purposes were the actual landowners, which basically comes down to the developers because the titles hadn't been secured yet in most cases, and therefore it was a question of the Surveyor General only wanted to know what they wanted. So as a result of that, there was some adjustments made, and having looked at it, I thought option 2 might have presented the best win for both the people of Rugby and the people of Howrah Gardens, who were affected by the potential boundary changes. As a result of that, I think we came back to council with a proposal to do option 2, which was agreed by the developers. Now, I'm saying in bringing that option 2 to council, which was agreed in principle, was on the basis that A, it was quite clear that the majority of councillors were in favour of some change in this area with their original vote, and also that the developers were prepared, given the impacts on areas like Rugby, to one of them in particular, to reduce his claim to option 2. Having said all that, that is the things that the Surveyor General will take notice of if we were to put a motion forward to change the boundaries. The option still lies with this council to decide to do nothing, in which case the status quo will remain and the Surveyor General will take no further interest in this particular issue. So I'm not here to say do or don't do option 2. I'm saying that option 2 is the one that the developers are prepared to be suited for, and that should something go forward, the Surveyor General is likely to be taking great note of that. So on that basis, it really comes down to the matter of each of us. Having consulted the wider community, which was not necessary, but it was necessary, I think, for us to know whether we should be going ahead with anything at all. And I leave it to the Aldermen to make up their own mind as to whether they think the status quo should remain with the risks it poses to changes to postcodes and things that could occur, or to go with option 2, which would be acceptable to the developers and, I might say, most of the people that I've spoken to in my travels. So I really put the question to each alderman to make their own mind up.
Alderman Blomley.
Thank you, Mayor. There's not really a great deal I'm able to add to that excellent overview of the history here, but I will just come back to that first meeting in early April when the motion first was brought into this chamber, and what I said then still stands true today, and that is that in my view, we as a council, having been approached by the landowners in that area, were duty bound to take the steps that we now know are the appropriate steps as set out by the nomenclature board. And that is what we've now done. It's a little bit rocky, as Alderman Mulder touched upon. A little bit rocky there at the start. But there has been that appropriate engagement now with the appropriate stakeholders. There was, of course, that July decision of this council that we provided in principle support. From that April decision to the July decision, here we are today, having done all the necessary steps. We are just doing what is right here. we are taking this proposal from the landowners to the nomenclature board and saying this is the approach that we've received. At the end of the day, you're the decision maker, not us. We are, if you like, a mere conduit. And the process there, it's in place for a very good reason. And some of us in this place may recall another development that, and the reason why these rules were put in place. And all we're doing now is following those rules. The decision rests not with us, but rests with the nomenclature board. I think we've arrived at a good place, and as a result, I am pleased to support recommendation, or part A of this recommendation, the motion before the chair at the moment, and seek the support of colleagues.
Thank you, Alderman Bromley. Any other speakers on part A? Alderman Warren.
Thank you. I will not be supporting this motion. I'll be voting against it as I have done consistently since this topic was raised. In voting to take this to the nomenclature board, it absolutely is our decision, because the requirements to consult with the three landowners comes from the nomenclature board. So it's kind of the wrong end of the process driving our decision. The decision is, does this benefit our community? Is this what our community wants? The informal consultation that we didn't have to have, and I apologise for using air quotes, was from memory, and I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but it was something like 60-40 against from those people who responded, who did not want Rokeby to be seen in any way as stigmatised and therefore not an acceptable postcode for the new development. So I do not believe that we have community support for this. It is immaterial that three developers approached us. It is our decision as to whether we feel that the business or the case has been made that a boundary change is warranted. And my belief is that the community does not support this wholeheartedly, and therefore we should not take this further.
Thanks.
Yes, look, it's interesting. It's the debate we should not be having, quite frankly. It's as simple as that. The comment made by Alderman Blomley is quite wrong. What he said was that...
Be very careful. Be very careful. Look, don't have privilege in this place.
Excuse me.
What he said, we were approached by the landowners to do this back in April. And in fact, the landowners, as my understanding goes, were in fact those three developers.
The landowners.
The landowners, however, have a different connotation as far as Land Tasmania is concerned, because the nomenclature board has said on page 103, Land Tasmania instead suggested that a boundary change in the area could be supported from a technical perspective and subject to consultation being undertaken that demonstrates a broad-based community support. Not three developers, but a broad-based community support. And they go on to say on page 104 to clarify what they mean by a broad-based community support. And I quote, in the circumstances, the affected landowners are the landowners and subdividers, Alderman Blomley, of the area known as Skillion Hill. So it's just not the subdividers, it's the landowners, which include the subdividers. And it's also to be demonstrated that those persons are within that area of option 2, nowhere else. And I've been arguing in this place on this particular matter at workshops that we are discriminating against those persons that actually live on the Rokeby side of Pass Road. Now, they have no say in this because the option 2 is in fact regarding the landowners and the developers that actually purport and which are basically enclosed within that option 2. So, you know, from April to when we actually revoked the decision, and even Alderman Edmonds got up and he said in this place, I apologise for at the time, I think his words were, I apologise for not making a mistake. Now, that's good stuff. That is good stuff, because at the end of the day, we made a monumental blunder in April. Then we tried to save face in the next motion, and now we have gone out to consultation. And the numbers. What about the numbers? If you look at on page 104, of those who voted via the, and I'm quoting, of those who voted via the Have Your Say portal, 68 respondents were Howrah or Rokeby residents, with 45 voting against and 23 voting for the proposed boundary alteration. And they go on, and the list just speaks for itself. I don't need to go through each and every one of these dot points on 105, but just to quote a few. Proposed change is not in the interests of community members and is not necessary as the existing boundary has defined itself. And another one which I could pick out, just elaborate on. It's always been Rokeby and the historic town of Rokeby will disappear. This is divisiveness. We made monumental blunders at the head of the canal at Lauderdale, and we had to basically talk to the community and backpedal on that, and now we're going down the same path by basically dividing the community on basically trying to use a sort of basis to say, look, we ought to encroach upon Rokeby and extend the Howrah precinct. I don't think that the Land Tasmania or the Nomenclature Board or the Surveyor General, who is basically responsible for this, will have a bar of this. And I don't think we're going to be able to save face unless we knock this out here and now, and therefore take it, basically take no further step. I do not support any change to the existing arrangement, and I believe it's appropriate, Madam Chairman, that we should basically kick this thing, kick the bucket down the road and do nothing more. Because I can see on the horizon that this is going to cause a lot of trouble, and at the end of the day, if the Nomenclature Board or the Land Tasmania decides to say, well look, this is not an issue, it's going to cause all sorts of problems, and therefore they will respond to council accordingly. I will not support the motion.
Thank you, Alderman James. Alderman Edmonds.
Thank you. A bit of talk about April tonight. I believe we rescinded that decision in July. Although to talk about that decision, it's not really what we're talking about tonight. You know, I had an open mind on the original decision. You know, let's hear what people think, etc. But that question was, do you want a new suburb? It wasn't, do you want Howrah to get even bigger? So anyway, we rescinded that motion in July. I think a few people referred to this as a pretty long journey, and my where I've ended up on that journey is in the status quo camp.
Really, I mean, my first thing I'll say is the whole nexus of that whole space is all over the place. And I was having a discussion today with Alderman Blomley about this point. And I mean, the issue about what happens with the other side of Pass Road, or the Clarence Bar side, and all that, I mean, that's a legitimate concern that we need to address. Putting our heads in the sand and not dealing with these issues is not the right approach either. And I mean, I don't know where Howrah starts and then, is it Mornington or Mount Rumney, or is it Cambridge in through Pass Road? So I mean, that is something else we're going to have to, you know, have a go at some stage too, because it is. I don't know the difference, and I've lived in Clarence for most of my life. So I think that's something that needs to be considered as part of all this as well. As for a couple of points that have been raised tonight, I mean, this issue about dividing the community, I mean, I totally disagree with that, because we're not changing anything for the existing people that are in their houses. And to say that we're dividing, to be honest, I think is actually fanning the flames of the whole situation. I think it's totally unnecessary, and I don't think we need to do that. People, if we change the boundary of Rokeby and Howrah, we're not affecting anyone in Rokeby. Right now, if they feel that way, it's only because people are out there saying they should be offended by it. And I think that is something that we shouldn't be doing. As for the community support, one way or the other, picking 60 respondents out of a community of thousands of people is not something that we should be basing our decision on, saying there's community support. against it. I just can't see how people can say that. All right. Bottom line is, we need to deal with this issue. There needs to be a line in the sand between what's there at the moment and what happens, and I think that this is a fair alignment in relation to the existing subdivision of what we called Howrah Gardens, which is still Howrah, aligning that subdivision up with where that subdivision is going to finish, and then lining it up with where the existing part of Rugby starts. I think that's a more than legitimate way to approach this whole situation. And I really wish that people would not divide people by saying they should be offended by this change. I mean, it's a change in boundaries that I think is a legitimate way to approach it. And I really wish we would actually refrain from doing that. Whenever changes we make like this, we don't need to do that. I mean, it doesn't affect anyone in their existing house. If we were changing someone's house, yes, you could probably make that point. But saying that people are going to be offended by us making this change, I think is totally unnecessary and out of line, and I don't think we should be doing it. And I'll be supporting the motion.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Right to reply, Alderman Mulder?
One of the things going for option 2, if there is to be a change, is the fact that if you have a look at the boundary, the current Howrah boundary, due to the situation in Glebe Hill, moved the Howrah boundary long before my time on this place, the first iteration or the current one, and it then comes up to Pass Road. Option 2 simply extends that in almost a straight line across Rugby Road and into the suburbs. The suburbs have clearly been, the options were clearly identified to make sure that no person, no neighbours on the same street would be in different postcodes. That is what the status quo will deliver, which is one of the reasons that I went for option 2. As for the postcode, these are matters for the Australia Post to determine. And had we had our time over again, I'm sure that the moving the Howrah boundary to the Pass Road and into the Clarence Plains watershed would not have been approved. If it had been approved, if it had not been approved, we would not be here today. I don't think anyone would have even thought of extending these boundaries, but we did. And if you want to look at logicality, I would like to suggest that we could probably push it back to the Meon Range watershed, but good luck in getting the people of Glebe Hill or Howrah Gardens to agree to the logical solution to the Howrah boundaries. That is too late. Yes, it is whether the boundary is extended to option 2 is not our decision. Whether we put the option to the nomenclature board is, and I think that, and I've been through this process, and there is no doubt that the people inside option 2 were the only ones that the nomenclature board will take note of, but that the people, which are basically most of the 3 developers, but that it's us that needs to take note of the wider community thought before we put this motion, before we decide whether or not we will send anything to the nomenclature board. So I haven't moved too much further from my original position, which is it's a matter for each of you to examine your conscience and see whether you think this is a good idea or not a good idea.
Thank you. We'll put part A, that we resolve to support the proposed boundary change option 2 and refer that to the nomenclature board for final decision. All those in favour? All those against? The motion is carried.
Previous directions, I now move part B.
Yes, thank you. Would you like to speak to it, Alderman Miller?
Yes. I'm not quite sure why this had to be taken in stages, but suffice to say that part B is a natural consequence and is a natural requirement of the process. Now that we've decided that we will have a boundary alteration, I think it's more than reasonable to provide the results of the consultation to the nomenclature board, and the nomenclature board will, of course, also have been privy to the fact that the people who it directed us to consult with over which of the options was favourable are all in support of option 2, which we have just agreed to send to the council. So I see no harm, as always, in providing the results of the community feelings about this to the General Manager. I make the observation, though, that the consultation was on our new notice board consultation. I think that in a situation like this, where we were particularly concerned about the people of Howrah Gardens, who were most affected by option 2 we've moved, I think it would not be that difficult to have letterboxed them, as I did on a number of occasions, or to have sent each of them a personal letter asking them for their views on this particular subject. It would have cost you about $130 in postage to hit each of those houses, and I don't think that we would have had to come back here and get a special vote out of the annual operating expenses to achieve such a direct and meaningful consultation. And if we had consulted in that way, we would not have had the consultation clouded by people who were outside the area.
Yes? Any other speakers? Alderman Blomley.
Thank you, Madam Acting Mayor. There is a reason why I asked for this recommendation to be presented in 2 parts tonight, and the reason for that is, and I'll just go back to the contribution of colleagues to Part A of this recommendation, where there was blatant misrepresentation regarding the broad-based community support that apparently came out 60-40 against. 60-40 against, as said by Alderman Warren and Alderman James, against this move to make changes in that part of the world. Let's be clear. In the recent presentation from Ms Shea, and that was available on Dropbox to all of us, we were informed that there were, and in our report, that there were a grand total of 68 residents who resided in either Howrah or Rokeby who participated in this survey. 68. Now, based on 2016 ABS census data, Howrah had a population some 3 years ago of 8,690 residents. Rokeby had a population of 3,375. So there is a combined population of some 12,065 residents. Based on these figures, Madam Acting Mayor, the survey group, that is this report that's seeking to pass off as representative of the wider community, accounts for 0.5% of the affected residents. Let me repeat that. 0.56%, less than 1% of the population. I mean, are we really then going to pass this off as representative? And I'm sure that Mrs Hogan, who was here earlier tonight, with her expertise in surveys, etc., would also have some difficulty in calling this a credible report. If we go to paragraph 2.12 on page 106 of the agenda, it reads, and I quote, "It is clear from the broad public consultation findings that on balance, the wider community does not support the proposed boundary alteration for various reasons." I mean, seriously, give me a break. I mean, broad public consultation. On balance, the wider community does not support. Less than 1% participated in this survey, and to seek to pass it off as representative is not only misleading, but in my opinion, beneath the integrity of this council. As we are advised, the rules make it clear that the primary consideration is the affected landowners must be consulted and the majority must give their support. We know that all 3 affected landowners support option 2, and frankly, any other advice to the nomenclature board is just white noise. and frankly irrelevant. As such, I urge colleagues not to support the motion before the Chair.
Alderman James.
Yes, look, white noises, again, Blomley is trying to sort of tone down the approach of community consultation. It's broad-based, and even if it was 8%, 9% and 11%, at the end of the day, the nomenclature board is going to consider what representation, what community consultation took place. And if the numbers are 60-40, 60 in favour, 40 against, then surely they will regard that as a reasonable consultation process and not white noise as has been spelled out by Alderman Blomley, where he purports to say that the three landowners are really the ones that ought to have their say and run this particular process. That's not so. It's broad-based community consultation, and at the end of the day, the point of having community consultation and the landowners as part and parcel of the process, then that is what will count. And it's ridiculous to even say that the three developers, landowners, will have their day. They will have their... That's not so, because the Land Tasmania has said, and I repeat again on page 103, from a technical perspective and subject to consultation being undertaken that demonstrates broad-based community support, and that is, community support is that the affected landowners are the landowners, subdividers in the area known as Skillion Hill. That is what will matter at the end of the day, and that is what I believe the nomenclature will look at and decide, and basically I believe it will give it the thumbs down.
In the interest of clarity, I might just ask the General Manager to see a brief description of what the nomenclature board described as broad community consultation.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. The Nomenclature Board's requirements, when we clarified those, because there was no definition of broad-based consultation, was that the focus was upon the owners of property within the relevant affected area. And in this case, that's the three landowners who are also the subdividers and developers. Within the context of the broader consultation that was carried out, that was done on the basis that there had been previously broad consultation in respect to the Howard Gardens suburb proposal, and on the basis that that consultation had occurred and that council had changed its decision to a boundary change and not a suburb creation, that it was appropriate in the circumstances to communicate that to the broader community and continue the consultation in respect to those views. The report as it stands simply seeks to clarify that, and the aim of recommendation B is to provide me with the opportunity to make sure that the Nomenclature Board understands the consultation that's happened and the distinction between the three landowners and those other respondents.
Are there any other speakers? Alderman Walker.
Here is a council agenda sitting before us, sitting in the table, sitting on the internet. These results aren't ASIO state secrets. They're already out there. I don't really have any issue with point B. It just seems a matter of procedural.
Any other speakers? Alderman Newington.
I don't know about one point. I mean, if the letter was headed, yeah, we approve Part A, but the next bit just said, after broad-based community consultation, the finding was on balance that it wasn't supported. Well, I'd have a concern with that. But hopefully the Nomenclature Board are smart enough to read between the lines and stick with what they told us to do, which is take notice of the property owners and recognise that the other points made are really irrelevant to their decision moving forward.
Any other speakers? Alderman Mulder, right at the glass.
I
think Alderman Newington nearly summed up my my address in reply. The letter that will go out, as the motion calls for, the General Manager to provide the results of the consultation to the Nomenclature Board. Now, that I would think would be along the lines of the part in the officer's report where it talks about community consultation.
Yep.
Right? So it then spells out the rules, right? It then goes to, you know, Land Tasmania advised that broad-based community consultation means those residents, it defines it. The report will no doubt have all the, will be, you know, will have the facts of 210 and 211 within it, so that it's, as Alderman Walker says, it's not rocket science, it's not ASIO state secrets, and I don't expect we're going to be raided by the Australian Federal Police looking to see where the, you know, who revealed this information. What we really got to have a look at, though, is that the boundary there, you know, we talk 60-40. Let's, you know, and just quietly drop the percentages off there. The actual numbers is 45 and 23. And as we've already been told, a number of those people were actually from Glebe Hill who aren't directly affected by this at all. So, you know, those sorts of factors are more about what the community that bothered to respond. I'd also like to point out, and I think this has been brought to my attention very early on in the piece, that councils or any other people who are engaged in broad-based surveys even are not to take note of people who don't respond. So you can't read anything in to non-responses. The most you could possibly read into them is they don't care one way or the other. But those sorts of issues, so no matter how small it is, and I'll repeat back the line that we had before, if there's only one representative, they deserve to have their voice heard. Right? Whether we agree with them or not is a different matter. So I have no problems and to be putting up to the Nomenclature Board those particular views and all the rest of it. Remember that the Nomenclature Board or the Surveyor General actually, when he was describing the two options, gave us points, the pros and cons of each of those options. They were his words, Alderman James, not mine. They were his words about, well, one was minimalist and one, you know, and the second one halfway, and out of that, we've picked two. So I don't mind being having full disclosure, and of course the Nomenclature Board will read into it the consultation that we require.
More than I'll put part B, that Council authorises the General Manager to provide results of the consultation. All those in favour? Those against? The motion is carried. Okay, 11.7.3 relates to the Derwent Estuary Programme. Thank you, Alderman Warren. We have a seconder. Thank you, Alderman Blomley. Alderman Warren. Would you like to speak to it?
Just to say, I think this is a fantastic program to be involved in, and very happy to see signing another 5-year partnership agreement.
I'll be supporting the recommendation, but at the same time I will be trying to point the finger at the EPA, because I think it's a toothless tiger. On the in the Mercury on the 13th of August 2019, we had sewage spills into the river. We had the Taswater making excuses, and on column 3, it said, and I quote, Taswater South and the East Regional Services Department Manager Brendan Hennigan said last night it didn't reflect well, but the two events were unrelated apart from being at the same site, unquote. And then we go across to this toothless tiger, the EPA. And in
relation to the motion, Alderman?
It is, because it is in relation to the motion, because we are signing up to the Derwent Estuary program, and as we've done since 1999, and I was there in 1999 when we had a meeting with the then convener, and we had a discussion about sort of the broad-based approach that the Derwent Estuary program was going to undertake. And some of that was about the tertiary treatment of a number of these particular plants that abound the Derwent. And as a result, we have continued to support it, and Clarence will be making a contribution, as has been outlined in the report, of some, currently 52,730, and that's been adopted in our annual planning, and that's great. But at the end of the day, the EPA, which is obviously the agency responsible for maintaining and making sure that we do it, that it does.
Point of order, Madam Mayor. This actually is an agreement that does not involve the EPA, and therefore I feel that it's an irrelevance to discussion.
And in conclusion, may I say that the EPA has basically said that has requested Taswater to undertake sampling, and this has been done, and the results are expected midweek.
Point of order, Madam Mayor. I'd like to reiterate what you just said.
Alderman James.
All right. Okay. All right. Look, at the end of the day, okay. At the end of the day, yes. Yes. At the end of the day, I believe it's appropriate to support this. However, at the end of the day, the Derwent's Estuary program has a responsibility to make sure how our money is spent, and that is to take to task, I believe, the EPA in fulfilling its duties of being able to maintain the cleanliness of the River Derwent, and it hasn't done that at all.
I believe that's one of their functions. Thank you for your comment. Are there any other speakers?
Yes,
Alderman James. Alderman Walker.
Apologies.
James Walker. Alderman James Walker.
Implicit apology accepted.
Yes.
I do support this motion because this is great monitoring. It's a sort of accountability that perhaps some of the aldermen around this table in the 80s might not have appreciated when there was perhaps a little bit of leakage from some of the Clarence systems in and around the system.
There was. But
did the aldermen might want to reflect on what they did about that at the time?
Thank you, Alderman Walker. Are there any other speakers? Alderman Mulder.
I'd just like to probably rise at a very similar point. I have concerns about council having to spend all this sort of money to manage to monitor the water quality of the Derwent River, when I think, and I agree with Alderman James on this perspective, that ought to be the responsible Environment Protection Authority. So it's a case of, why are we doing this? Why are all the councils here doing the EPA's job?
Made a good point.
Alderman von Berter.
Madam Acting Mayor, this agreement covers a great deal more than the matter that Alderman Mulder and Alderman James have just referred to. I think it's well worth reading the actual agreement to look at the breadth of it, and also the workshop presentation that we were provided with gave the scope of what is actually involved, and as far as I'm concerned, it's $56,000 very well spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman von Berter. Other speakers? Alderman Warren, right to reply.
Thank you. In response to some of the concerns, I thank Alderman James for raising those concerns, but I believe the description of a toothless tiger would imply that this body has some sort of regulatory enforcement role, which they don't, and I refer Alderman James to 2.5 on page 110 of the agenda, which lists the functions as being a monitoring and facilitating the reduction of nutrients, etc., not enforcing and giving EPA a whack when they don't do the right thing. I believe that this program has been phenomenally popular with our community, and people now look to this program to know whether it's safe to swim in beaches where we simply didn't have that information a few years ago. And as Alderman von Berto says, the presentation at workshop told us so much more about the importance of this program and how they're actually leading some of the restitution of the health of our river. So I would urge Alderman to fully support this motion. Thank you.
Put the motion that we continue participation and authorise signing the new 5-year partnership agreement on behalf of Council. All those in favour? Carried unanimously, I think. No? Sorry, I missed you. Those against?
I made my point. It was recorded
Carried.
on the tape.
Alderman Mulder voted against.
Be sure to check that one out.
Sorry. I missed your hand. Thank you. Okay, Alderman's question time. Alderman Mulder, would you like to start?
Referring once again to the Kangaroo Bay development and the Mayor's suggestion that it may have to be a staged development, have Council staff been engaged in any discussions with the developers? When can Council expect to receive the building application? And is it expected to be a staged construction?
Thank you for the question. The Kangaroo Bay Hotel development, as Alderman will be aware from the previous decision regarding the 6-month extension, we're expecting a response from the developer before the 17th of November. At this point in time, we haven't got any details, although we have been assured that we'll have information before that date. And we are encouraging that for late October, early November, so that we can bring that to Council and present that as a report.
I understood that the contract requires substantial commencement of the construction by the November date. Would the submission of a BA, I would say, would not be commencement? There needs to be. I think there needs to be things rising up out of the ground by then.
That's correct. The alternative is that the council has provided a further extension of time, subject to the proposal that's been made.
At this stage, just for clarification, there's been no suggestion from them or stage of the development?
That would be part of whatever they come forward with. We haven't got any details at this point.
Yes, Acting Mayor, perhaps through you to General Manager. Do we have any update on any further development planned other than what's underway at the moment for the One Hill Estate at Acton, 7 Mile Beach?
I might ask Mr Lovell to respond to that. I'm not aware of the detail.
I'm not aware of anything, but if I could find out later, I can
Now I get asked two things, don't I? I do.
That's one.
Right, first one is, I suppose Mr Graham would be able to, through you, Acting Mayor, the status of the toilet at the Lawndale Canal and where we're at with that one.
Through Acting Mayor, the design drawings are virtually complete on that. Our cost estimates for that have come in greater than the budgets allowed for Council, adopted by Council. So we're looking at funding options in terms of our other projects in the program as to when that can be put out for quotations. But I can inform Council through the process with that.
I ran some Lawndale people on the weekend and that's where I copped that one. And the second one that I've sort of thought about, a lot of the time when I drive around the corner on Cambridge Road, Clarence Street to Cambridge Road, the house or the half-built block wall. Has anyone asked that before?
Many times.
Many times. But yes, please feel free to ask again.
Can I ask it again?
Of course.
It's a full question.
And that would be a Mr Toohey question, I perhaps.
Through you, Acting Mayor, with respect to this one, the building permit expires this month, and we're waiting to see whether that date, what happens by that date, whether an extension is sought. It's up to the building surveyor, the private building surveyor who's been engaged by that. I'm also aware this particular building also, the applicant has also lodged development, a DA, which is still going through the process of requiring further information.
DA on that same site?
Yes, a DA on the same site. Well, as I understand it, Mr. Lovell can probably confirm, the applicant wishes to place another storey on that building that may be residential apartments. However, this is they're requesting further information before it can proceed to the next stages.
Last meeting, I got a response to a question in relation to relating to funding that has been used in relation to a study for the Croquet Club. Question today is again around a similar quantum of around $20,000, which Council decided to strip from Business East in its ongoing activities and support it provides the city. So my question today relates to the fact that through the budget process we decided it would be, or councils collectively decided they wished to include amongst staff a business bureaucrat to help business, and I understand through discussions with Mr Nelson that what that role might be is something that will be sort of thought strategically perhaps in the short term. But if that position was to have been fully funded in the 1920 year, and we're now nearly into September, surely we're almost coming up to $20,000 worth of funding that could have been. Could that funding now be, that this unspent funding be allocated to Business East so that they can carry on supporting business like they have done in times past?
Manager.
Thank you for the question. The funding, if my memory is correct, is related to an Economic Development Officer position, which is a backfill for Mr Sadler's position since he took over the acting manager role. That funding was approximately, if my memory is correct, around $70,000 for the year. In the context of an Economic Development Officer, that's not a significant amount of money, and we may expect to use most of that during the year, not only in terms of recruiting to the position, which we're currently about to go to market on, but also in terms of any consultancy that we may need for specialist input. Ultimately, it would be a matter for council if they wanted to redirect that money, but it would have a material impact upon the economic development role.
So supplementary with the business bureaucrat role, you quoted 70,000, and in that quantum, you're including the super component, the quantum to account for leave loading, and presumably the payroll tax burden that would be on that position as well.
It's ballpark around that number. It's not a significantly highly paid role. It's reporting directly to Mr Sadler and will be under his mentorship. So it is not a lot of funds for that sort of position. I can get you specific details if that helps. We budget and as a total cost of employment across the board when we do that.
Hold on, yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, question through you to probably Mr Graham. Has the Bayfield Street footpath been taken over by council yet? And if not, are all the repairs done to the footpath and parts around it been done?
Yeah, Acting Mayor, I don't believe that we've taken over yet. There's been final inspections been done, and there's rectification works to be undertaken. I'll provide a briefing to Alderman when I investigate further information.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
No questions?
No, thank you.
Yes, two questions. Firstly, Mr Nelson would be aware of Mitch Rowlands' request and Council having reported that it was a late representation from the in relation to the education development at the Cambridge Primary School, and subsequent to that your staff have written to the to LUPA regarding what stance it's going to take as regards to whether or not the application ought to be re-advertised and put back to Council for consideration. Given that, have you heard that Minister Rockcliffe has reneged on funding for the development, and if so, when did this occur?
Thanks for the question. I'm not specifically aware of the government's position in respect to funding, although I have been informally advised that funding for the Department of Education wasn't included in this year's budget in respect to the Cambridge Primary School. But as I said, I've only been informally advised of that and not formally. I can confirm if you wish. No problems.
The second question is in relation to, and my question through you to our Chief Finance Officer, and that is the Chief Finance Officer is aware of the circumstances regarding the property owner at 265 Richmond Road, Cambridge, where he has had an increase in his rates of 18.5%. Given that very, very high percentage, is it within council means to be able to apply a capping in relation to these rates when in fact they go over the top? In other words, when they get to a stage of being, through the question through, is there any way in which council can cap and make a realistic approach, or how would we say it, to very, very high rate increases of the level of 18.5, or do we have to run with it because that's what the valuation has been determined by the Valuer General? Perhaps it's a question and clarification, please.
If I may, Alderman James,
yes.
I'll answer that question. Council, within its rating decision, has a set of caps in place, and I think the cap on residential property is 30%, 20%. There's caps in place for commercial properties, a number of other types of property as well. So in the specific instance that you're referring to, the increase as a result of the fresh valuation was under the cap and therefore provided through to the particular ratepayer.
So supplementary, is council, and again we've had this debate and obviously we've set the rates, but is council at liberty to lower that capping level in circumstances in particular where there's been a valuation undertaken?
Council has a rating policy, and those caps are set as part of the policy. It's ultimately a matter for council if those caps are to be changed. Any change to those caps will alter the distribution across ratepayers within the city. So it's a question of modelling as well to see exactly what that did.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about Eastern Barred Bandicoots, and I apologise, this is a little late in coming, but a couple of months ago I believe that the undergrowth was cleared in Wentworth Park in response to antisocial behaviour, and just checking that the council was aware that that is a habitat of, even though the bandicoots are not threatened species here, they are on the mainland, and what steps council were taking to protect the habitat of those bandicoots, please.
Acting Mayor, I'll follow through, investigate and provide advice in relation to that.
Who was antisocial? Which bandicoot was antisocial?
Fresh bandicoot.
Thank you very much. We now need to move into a closed meeting. Thank you very much for your attendance tonight.